The year was 1889, and in the dusty streets of Millbrook, Tennessee, a father's desperation would set in motion one of the most extraordinary transformations the South had ever witnessed. What started as the most heartbreaking betrayal imaginable would become a story of resilience that defied every expectation of what a silent girl could achieve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and broken dreams through the narrow streets of Millbrook, where wooden storefronts leaned against each other like tired old men sharing secrets. The town had seen better days before the railroad passed them by, before the cotton mill closed, before hope became as scarce as honest work. Ezra Mitchell stood outside Brennan's general store, his calloused hands trembling not from the October chill, but from something far colder that had settled in his chest. The man who once owned 40 acres of the finest tobacco land in Hamilton County now wore boots held together with twine and a coat that had seen too many seasons of shame. Behind him, pressed against the store's weathered wall, stood his daughter, Sarah, 17 years old, with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes that held more wisdom than most folks twice her age. She watched her father's shoulders shake, and though no sound escaped her lips, had never escaped her lips, her silence spoke volumes to anyone willing to listen. But Ezra Mitchell had stopped listening to his daughter's silence years ago. 75 cents, he whispered to himself, staring at the crumpled bills in his palm. 3 quarters and 2 dimes. The sum total of what remained after he'd sold his late wife's wedding ring to old man Brennan. It wasn't enough for the medicine. It was never enough for anything anymore. The consumption had been eating away at his lungs for 2 years now, each coughing fit bringing up more blood and taking more of his strength. The doctor in Nashville had been clear without the proper medicine. Ezra had maybe 3 months left. With it, perhaps a year. Maybe 2 if he was lucky, but luck was something the Mitchell family had run out of long ago. Sarah touched her father's elbow gently, her fingers barely grazing the worn fabric of his sleeve. When he turned to look at her, she signed with practiced movements, her hands forming words that most people in Millbrook couldn't understand and didn't care to learn. "We'll find another way," her hands said. "We always do." Ezra's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for weeks. His daughter's optimism had been their only constant companion through 3 years of watching everything they'd built slip away like sand through desperate fingers. First the drought that killed their crops, then the bankers' visits that grew more frequent and more threatening. Finally, the foreclosure that left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and each other. But each other wasn't going to pay for medicine. Each other wasn't going to put food in their bellies or a roof over their heads when winter came calling with its cruel promises. The general store's bell chimed as the door opened, and Brennan himself emerged, a thick-set man with suspicious eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled. He glanced at Ezra, then at Sarah, and something shifted in his expression. Not kindness, exactly, but a recognition that even he wasn't immune to. "Still here, Mitchell?" Brennan asked, though his tone held less of its usual edge. "Stores closing soon." Ezra straightened, trying to summon dignity from somewhere deep inside his hollowed chest. "Just thinking, is all." "Thinking don't pay debts," Brennan replied, but he said it quietly, without his usual venom. Even he could see that Ezra Mitchell was a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into darkness. It was then that they heard the hoofbeats. A single horse, moving at an unhurried pace down Main Street, its rider barely visible in the growing dusk. The horse was magnificent, a paint stallion with markings like spilled ink on fresh snow, but it was the rider that made the few remaining. Townspeople stepped back into doorways and lowered their voices to whispers. He sat tall in the saddle, wrapped in a dark coat that covered him from neck to knee. A wide-brimmed hat cast shadows across his face, but what drew the eye and quickened the pulse was the hood he wore beneath the hat. Made of soft leather and decorated with intricate beadwork, that caught what little light remained in the day. It covered the upper half of his face completely, leaving only his mouth and strong jaw visible. The Cherokee man had been coming to Millbrook for 3 months now, always alone, always conducting his business in silence. He paid in silver for supplies, asked no questions, and answered fewer. Some said he was a medicine man. Others whispered he was an outlaw hiding from federal marshals. The children, with their cruel honesty, called him the Ghost Rider. But Sarah Mitchell saw something different when she looked at him. She saw someone who understood what it meant to live in a world that feared what it couldn't understand. The horse stopped directly in front of the general store, and the hooded man dismounted with fluid grace. He was taller than Ezra by half a foot, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command respect. Brennan nodded nervously. "Evening, sir. Store is still open if you need anything." The Cherokee man's voice, when it came, was deep and careful, each word chosen with deliberate precision. "I require salt, flour, coffee if you have it fresh." As Brennan scurried inside to gather the requested items, the hooded man's attention turned to Ezra and Sarah. His gaze, what little could be seen of it, lingered on the girl, taking in her worn dress, her careful posture, the way she kept one protective hand near her father's arm. And then he did something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. He signed to her. "Good evening." His hands said in the fluid language she thought only she and her father knew in this small town. "You seem troubled." Sarah's eyes widened, and she glanced quickly at her father, who was staring at the exchange with growing confusion. Ezra had learned sign language out of necessity after Sarah's condition became clear, but he'd never seen another soul in Millbrook who could speak with their hands. "My father is sick." Sarah signed back, her movements hesitant but grateful. "We have no money for medicine." The Cherokee man nodded slowly, his attention shifting to Ezra, who was now coughing violently into a handkerchief that came away, spotted with blood. "Consumption," the hooded man said aloud, and it wasn't a question. Ezra straightened, defensive. "It's nothing that concerns you, stranger." "Perhaps not," the man agreed. "But desperation has a sound all its own. I hear it in your breathing, see it in the way you count those coins, as if counting them again might make them multiply." Brennan emerged from the store with the requested supplies, glancing nervously between the 3 figures. The Cherokee man paid him with silver coins that caught the last light of day, then turned back to Ezra. "You have something I might trade for," he said quietly. Ezra's face hardened. "I got nothing left to sell." The hooded man's gaze moved to Sarah, who felt her heart begin to race. Not with fear, exactly, but with something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps. The sense that this moment would change everything, though she couldn't yet fathom how. "You have a daughter," the Cherokee man said simply. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ezra's face went white, then red, then white again. His hands clenched into fists that shook with more than illness. "She's not for sale," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not looking to buy," the man replied calmly. "I'm looking to make an investment." Sarah stepped forward, her hands moving quickly. "What kind of investment?" The Cherokee man watched her signs, then responded in kind. "The kind that transforms both parties. You need medicine for your father. I need someone who can learn, who can see beyond the surface of things. Someone who knows what it means to be different in a world that fears difference." Aloud, he said to Ezra, 75 cents. That's what you have there, yes? I'll give you that amount again for a year of your daughter's time." "A year?" Ezra's voice cracked. "What would you want with her for a year?" "To teach her things this town never could. To show her that silence can be more powerful than the loudest voice. To help her understand that being different isn't a curse, It's a gift waiting to be unwrapped. Sarah's hands moved frantically. Father, what is he saying? But Ezra wasn't looking at his daughter. He was staring at the Cherokee man with the desperate calculation of a drowning man who'd just been thrown a rope. 75 cents would buy the medicine. Maybe enough for 2 doses. Maybe enough to buy him time to figure out something else. And after the year? Ezra asked hoarsely. She returns. To you, if that's what she chooses. But I suspect, the hooded man's voice carried a note of certainty that was almost unsettling. She won't be the same person who left. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rattling the loose boards on Brennan's storefront and the distant sound of Ezra's labored breathing. Sarah looked between the two men, understanding dawning on her face like sunrise over a mountain ridge. Her father was considering it. Actually considering selling her to a stranger for the price of his medicine. But as she watched the Cherokee man, really watched him, she saw something in his posture, in the careful way he held himself, that told her this wasn't what it appeared to be. This wasn't a transaction born of cruelty or desperate exploitation. This was rescue, disguised as commerce. Why me? She signed to the hooded man. His response came without hesitation. Because you've already learned the most important lesson. You know how to listen with more than your ears. Ezra coughed again, harder this time, and when he pulled the handkerchief away, there was more blood than before. The Cherokee man reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. This will help with the coughing, he said, offering it to Ezra. But it's only temporary. The real medicine costs more than 75 cents. Sarah watched her father's face cycle through emotions like clouds racing across a storm-torn sky. Love, desperation, guilt, hope, and finally, the terrible resolve of a man who had run out of choices. 1 year, Ezra whispered. 1 year, the Cherokee man confirmed. And you'll treat her well? You single quotes LL ... you'll keep her safe? For the first time, something like warmth entered the hooded man's voice. Safer than she's ever been. Ezra turned to his daughter, his eyes brimming with tears and apologies. Sarah, God forgive me. I don't know what else to do. Sarah stepped forward and took her father's trembling hands in hers. She signed slowly, carefully, wanting him to understand every word. I know you love me. I know this hurts you more than it hurts me. And I know that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust a stranger to help us when we can't help ourselves. Then she turned to the Cherokee man and signed. I'll go with you. But I have conditions. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. I would expect nothing less. What are your conditions? My father gets the medicine he needs, not just what 75 cents will buy. And if after this year I choose to leave you and return to him, you won't stop me. Agreed, he signed back immediately. And I have a condition of my own, which is that you call me by my name. It's Thomas. Thomas Blackwater. Sarah nodded, and for the first time in months, something like hope flickered in her chest. Not hope for her father's recovery, though she prayed for that too, but hope for something she couldn't yet name. Something that felt like possibility. Thomas Blackwater reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather bundle, which he handed to Ezra. Enough medicine for 3 months, he said. And money to buy more when that runs out. Ezra's hands shook as he accepted the bundle. I don't understand. Why would you? Because sometimes, Thomas said, helping Sarah up onto his horse. What? Looks like a sale is actually a salvation. As the paint stallion began to move down Main Street, Sarah turned back to wave goodbye to her father. Ezra stood in the gathering darkness, clutching the medicine that would save his life and watching his daughter disappear into an uncertain future. Neither of them knew that they had just set in motion events that would transform not just their lives but the entire town of Millbrook. And it all began with 75 cents and a father's desperate love. The hoofbeats faded into the distance. leaving only the wind and the weight of choices that could never be undone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ride through the Tennessee hills lasted 3 hours, following trails that seemed to exist only in Thomas Blackwater's memory. Sarah had never ventured this far from Millbrook, and as the familiar landmarks disappeared behind them, she felt herself entering a world that operated by entirely different rules. Thomas rode with the easy confidence of someone who knew every stone and stream in these mountains. He had given Sarah his coat when the night air grew sharp, and now she wrapped herself in leather that smelled of sage and wood smoke. The coat was too large for her, but it carried a warmth that went beyond mere temperature. When they finally stopped, it wasn't at the crude cabin or isolated homestead Sarah had been expecting. Instead, they stood before a sprawling property that took her breath away. The main house was built from local stone and timber, but constructed with an architect's eye for both beauty and function. 3 stories tall with wide porches that wrapped around the entire structure. It commanded a view of the valley below that must have stretched for 20 miles on a clear day. Warm light spilled from multiple windows, and smoke rose from several chimneys, suggesting a household that was very much alive and active. But it was the other buildings that truly amazed Sarah. She counted at least 6 separate structures: a massive barn, what appeared to be workshops, a greenhouse with glass panels that caught the moonlight, and several smaller buildings whose purposes she couldn't immediately determine. This wasn't the home of an outlaw or a hermit. This was the estate of someone who had built something extraordinary in the wilderness. Thomas dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse, his hands steady and respectful. As her feet touched the ground, she realized she was trembling, not from cold or fear, but from the overwhelming sense that she had just crossed a threshold into a life she could never have imagined. Welcome to Ridgeview, Thomas signed to her, and even in the moonlight she could see something like pride in his posture. Before Sarah could respond, the main house's front door opened, spilling golden light across the porch. A woman emerged, and Sarah's preconceptions shattered like glass hitting stone. The woman was Cherokee, perhaps 40 years old, with silver streaks threading through hair that hung in a long braid down her back. She wore a dress that was clearly expensive deep blue silk with intricate beadwork that complemented rather than imitated traditional Cherokee designs. But it was her bearing that commanded attention. She moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered. "Thomas," the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of someone who had spent time in eastern cities. "You're later than expected." "The conversation took longer than anticipated, Margaret," Thomas replied, removing his hat but keeping his hood in place. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Margaret Blackwater, my sister." Margaret stepped closer, and Sarah found herself being studied by intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. But unlike the suspicious gazes she was used to in Millbrook, this examination felt evaluative, as if Margaret were assessing potential rather than looking for flaws. "She's younger than you said." Margaret signed, her movements as fluid as Thomas's had been. Sarah's eyes widened. Another person who spoke with hands. In Millbrook, she had thought herself and her father were the only ones who knew this language. 17, Thomas signed back. "But she's old enough to make her own choices." "She chose to come, did she?" Margaret's expression was skeptical. "Or did circumstances choose for her?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah realized that this woman, Thomas's sister, was not simply going to accept her presence without question. Margaret Blackwater was clearly someone who protected what was hers, and right now, Sarah was an unknown quantity. Sarah stepped forward, squaring her shoulders the way she had learned to do when facing the cruel whispers and pointing fingers of Millbrook's residents. She looked directly at Margaret and signed with careful precision. "My father is dying. He needed medicine. Your brother offered me a choice. Stay in Millbrook and watch my father die while we both starved, or come here and learn something that might change both our lives. I chose to come, but not because I had no other options. I chose to come because I recognized something in your brother that I've never seen in anyone else. And what was that? Margaret asked. Someone who sees difference as strength instead of weakness. Margaret studied Sarah for a long moment, then slowly nodded. When she spoke aloud, her voice had warmed considerably. Thomas told me you were perceptive. I'm beginning to see what he meant. She gestured toward the house. You must be exhausted. Let's get you settled, and tomorrow we can begin to explain exactly what you've gotten yourself into. As they walked toward the house, Sarah couldn't help but stare at everything around her. The porch alone was larger than the entire shack she and her father had been living in. Wind chimes made from what looked like carved bone and polished stones created soft music in the night breeze. Chairs and tables were arranged to take advantage of the view, suggesting that the people who lived here actually had time to sit and appreciate beauty. Inside, the house was even more impressive. The main room featured a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, surrounded by furniture that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Books lined built-in shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, more books than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings in heavy frames depicted landscapes and portraits with skill that spoke of professional artists. But it was the people that truly surprised her. A Cherokee man, perhaps Thomas's age, emerged from what appeared to be a study, carrying a ledger and wearing spectacles that gave him a scholarly appearance. A woman who might have been white, black, or some mixture of both came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that covered a dress nicer than anything Sarah had ever owned. These weren't servants or hired hands. The way they moved, the way they interacted with Thomas and Margaret, made it clear they were equals in whatever enterprise this household represented. Sarah, Thomas said, removing his coat but still keeping his hood in place. Let me introduce you to the heart of our operation here. This is Dr. Samuel Ross. He indicated the man with the ledger. And this is Elizabeth Harper. Dr. Ross stepped forward with a warm smile. Welcome, Sarah. Thomas has told us a great deal about you. Elizabeth Harper nodded kindly. I've prepared a room for you upstairs. I imagine you'd like to wash and rest before we begin explaining things. Sarah looked around the room at these people who seemed to have been expecting her, who had prepared for her arrival, who were treating her not as a purchase or a burden, but as a guest. Her hands moved hesitantly. I don't understand. Who are you all? What is this place? Margaret answered, settling into a chair near the fire. We're what happens when people who don't fit into the world everyone else recognizes decide to build a world of their own. And what kind of world is that? Sarah asked. Thomas sat across from his sister, finally pushing back his hood. For the first time, Sarah saw his full face. He was perhaps 35, with strong Cherokee features and eyes that held depths of experience she couldn't fathom. But it was the scars that made her breath catch, burn scars that covered the left side of his face and neck, explaining why he kept his features hidden from the world. A world, Thomas said quietly, where a Cherokee man with a ruined face can become one of the wealthiest landowners in 3 counties, where a woman who refuses to marry can run businesses that employ 50 people, where a former slave can become a doctor, and a girl who can't speak can learn to command respect without saying a word. Dr. Ross settled into another chair, his manner suggesting this was a conversation they had had before with other newcomers. We're what you might call an alternative community, Sarah. People come here for various reasons. Some are running from something. Others are running towards something. But all of us share one common trait, which is, Sarah signed, we refuse to let the world's limitations define what we can become. Elizabeth Harper said simply, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of constraints she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For 17 years, she had accepted that her silence made her less than others, that her father's poverty made them both invisible, that her gender and her disability would forever confine her to the margins of life. But looking around this room at these people who radiated confidence and purpose, she began to wonder if everything she had accepted as truth might actually be negotiable. What do you do here? She asked Thomas. We trade, he said simply, but not in the way most people understand trading. We deal in things that can't be easily measured or counted. Information, connections, solutions to problems that conventional businesses can't or won't address. Margaret leaned forward. Tell me, Sarah, in Millbrook, what did people say about Thomas when he came to trade? Sarah hesitated, then signed honestly. They called you the Ghost Rider. They said you might be an outlaw or a medicine man or someone hiding from the law. They were afraid of you. Exactly, Margaret smiled. And that fear, that mystery, that assumption that they understood what they were looking at, that's worth more than gold to people in our line of work. I still don't understand what your work is. Dr. Ross adjusted his spectacles. Let me give you an example. 3 months ago, a wealthy plantation owner in Georgia was having problems with crop diseases that were destroying his cotton. The agricultural experts he consulted couldn't help him. The university professors were baffled. He was facing bankruptcy. What did you do? Thomas rode down there, dressed exactly as you saw him tonight. Mysterious, foreign, slightly dangerous. He examined the fields, consulted with local Cherokee elders who still remembered old growing techniques, and provided a solution that saved the man's entire crop. And he paid you for this? Handsomely, Thomas nodded. But more importantly, he told other wealthy landowners about the mysterious Cherokee who had saved his livelihood. Within a month, we had contracts from 6 different plantations across 3 states. Elizabeth Harper stood and moved to a cabinet, returning with a leather portfolio. We provide services that can't be found in any bank or business school. We solve problems that require thinking outside the boundaries of conventional society, and we charge accordingly. She opened the portfolio to reveal documents, maps, and correspondence that spoke of business dealings across the South. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the figures being discussed, amounts of money that dwarfed anything she had ever imagined. You're all wealthy? Comfortable, Margaret said diplomatically. But more importantly, we're free. Free to live according to our own rules. Free to use our differences as advantages rather than hiding from them as weaknesses. Thomas stood and walked to one of the tall windows that looked out over the valley. Sarah, your father sold you to me for 75 cents because he saw no other choice. But what he actually did was give you the opportunity to discover that the very things that made you different in Millbrook, your silence, your ability to observe, your experience as an outsider, are exactly the qualities that could make you extraordinarily valuable in our world. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in her life, she was hearing someone suggest that she wasn't broken, that she didn't need to be fixed or hidden or apologize for. What would you want me to learn? She asked. Everything, Dr. Ross said with a grin. Reading, writing, mathematics, languages, business principles, legal concepts, social dynamics. But most importantly, you'll learn to see opportunities where others see only problems. And after a year? Margaret's expression grew serious. After a year, you'll have a choice to make. You can return to your father, and you'll take with you enough money and knowledge to ensure both of you live comfortably for the rest of your lives, or, Thomas turned back from the window, or you can stay and become part of what we're building here. Either way, you'll never again be the powerless girl who stood in front of Brennan's store tonight. Sarah looked around the room, these remarkable people who had somehow built lives of influence and prosperity despite Or perhaps because of being everything the conventional world told them they couldn't be. When do we start? She signed. Margaret smiled. Tomorrow. But tonight, you rest. Elizabeth will show you to your room. And in the morning, we begin the process of transforming you from Sarah Mitchell, the mute daughter nobody wanted, into someone those same people will pay handsomely to consult. As Elizabeth led her up a staircase carved from what must have been a single massive oak tree, Sarah realized that the transaction at Brennan's store had been the end of one story and the beginning of another. She had spent 17 years learning to be invisible. Now she was going to learn to be unforgettable. And for the first time since her mother died, Sarah Mitchell fell asleep believing that tomorrow might be better than today. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of voices drifting through her bedroom window. Not the harsh, argumentative tone she had grown accustomed to in Millbrook, but measured conversation that carried the rhythm of serious business being conducted. The room Elizabeth had given her was larger than the entire dwelling she had shared with her father, furnished with a 4-poster bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe that could have housed 3 families' worth of clothing. Most striking were the windows, tall and wide, offering a view of the valley that stretched to the horizon like a promise of endless possibility. She dressed quickly in the clothes that had been laid out for her, a simple but well-made dress in deep green wool, stockings without holes, and boots that actually fit her feet. When she looked at herself in the polished mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized the person staring back. Clean, properly clothed, and rested, she looked less like a charity case and more like someone who belonged in a house like this. Following the voices, she made her way downstairs to find the household already deep in the business of the day. The main room had been transformed from the welcoming parlor of the night before into something resembling a war room. Maps covered every available surface, letters were sorted into precise stacks, and ledgers lay open, displaying columns of figures. That made Sarah's eyes widen. Thomas stood at the center of it all, no longer the mysterious hooded figure from Millbrook, but clearly the commander of a complex operation. His hood was down, revealing the full extent of his scars in the morning light. They were extensive, covering the left side of his face and disappearing beneath his shirt collar. But rather than making him appear diminished, they seemed to add to his authority. These were the marks of someone who had survived something terrible and emerged stronger. Margaret sat at the large table, corresponding with what appeared to be 3 different people simultaneously. She would write a few lines in one letter, set it aside, pick up another, add a paragraph, then move to the third. Her efficiency was mesmerizing. Dr. Ross was examining what looked like soil samples through a magnifying glass, making notes in a leather journal. Elizabeth Harper was nowhere to be seen, but the smell of coffee and baking bread suggested she was managing the domestic side of this enterprise. It was Thomas who noticed Sarah first. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying none of the careful distance of the night before. "I hope you slept well. We have a great deal to show you today." Margaret looked up from her correspondence. "Before we begin your education, Sarah, we thought you should understand exactly what you've become part of. Understanding the scope of our work will help you grasp why the skills we want to teach you are so valuable." Sarah approached the table, her eyes taking in the organized chaos of documents and maps. "What exactly do you do?" She signed. Dr. Ross set down his magnifying glass and smiled. "We solve problems that conventional society either can't or won't address. But perhaps it would be easier to show you rather than tell you." Thomas moved to one of the maps, this one showing the southeastern United States with various locations marked in different colored pins. 3 months ago, we received a letter from a group of freedmen in Alabama. They had pooled their resources to buy land for farming, but the white landowners in the area were sabotaging their efforts, poisoning wells, destroying crops, threatening violence. "What could you do about that?" Sarah asked. "Officially?" "Nothing," Margaret said. setting down her pen. But Thomas rode down there as the mysterious Cherokee medicine man, claimed the land was cursed by ancient spirits angry about the violence, and performed an elaborate cleansing ceremony that involved spreading a particular type of mineral dust over the affected areas. Sarah looked puzzled. Mineral dust? Dr. Ross grinned. A compound that makes plants grow faster and stronger while being completely harmless to humans or animals. The freedmen's crops thrived while their neighbors' fields remained ordinary. Within a month, the white landowners were paying us to cleanse their property too. And the threats of violence? Thomas's expression grew serious. Those stopped when word spread that the Cherokee medicine man had connections to federal marshals who were very interested in enforcing Reconstruction laws. Which was true. I do have such connections, though not for the reasons the troublemakers assumed. Sarah stared at the map, beginning to understand the complexity of what these people had accomplished. You used their own prejudices against them. Exactly, Margaret nodded approvingly. People see what they expect to see. Thomas appears as a mysterious, slightly dangerous Cherokee with mystical knowledge. They assume he's everything they've been told to fear about Indians. But what they're actually encountering is a Harvard-educated businessman who understands chemistry, law, and human psychology. Harvard? Sarah's hands nearly stuttered in surprise. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his scarred features. Class of 1876. I was one of 3 Cherokee students in the university's history at that time. My professors thought I was an interesting experiment in civilizing the savage. I let them think that while I learned everything they could teach me about how their world really works. And the scars? The room fell quiet for a moment. Thomas touched the damaged side of his face unconsciously. Those came later, he said softly. When I tried to use my education in conventional ways. I opened a law practice in Nashville, thinking that a Harvard degree would be enough to overcome prejudice. I was wrong. Someone decided to teach me that education doesn't change what people see when they look at a Cherokee. Margaret's voice was hard. They burned his office, with him inside. Sarah felt her stomach clench. I'm sorry. Don't be, Thomas said firmly. Those scars taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. I learned that trying to succeed by their rules, in their world, was a fool's game. So I decided to create my own rules and my own world. Elizabeth Harper appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray laden with coffee, bread, and what appeared to be several types of preserves. Which brings us to why you're here, Sarah. As Elizabeth distributed the food, Margaret pulled out a different set of documents. Each of us brings something unique to this enterprise. Thomas provides the public. Face mysterious, competent, slightly dangerous. I handle the business correspondence and financial management. Samuel provides scientific expertise. Elizabeth manages our domestic operations and serves as our connection to certain underground networks that prove useful. Underground networks? Sarah asked. Elizabeth sat down with her own cup of coffee. I was born a slave in Virginia. Escaped on the Underground Railroad when I was 16. Spent 5 years helping other people escape before the war ended. The skills you learn moving people and information in secret don't become useless just because slavery is officially over. Sarah looked around the table at these 4 people, each of whom had taken circumstances that should have destroyed them and instead used them to build something extraordinary. What would I contribute? She asked. Dr. Ross leaned forward. You already demonstrated it last night, though you may not have realized it. What do you mean? When you met each of us, you read us correctly within minutes, Thomas explained. You saw that Margaret was protective and intelligent, that she wouldn't accept you without testing your worthiness. You recognized that Samuel and Elizabeth were equals here, not servants. You understood that I was offering rescue disguised as transaction. Margaret nodded. Most people see what they expect to see. But you see what's actually there. That's an incredibly rare and valuable skill. I just pay attention. Exactly, Elizabeth smiled. And paying attention, really paying attention, is the foundation of everything we do here. Thomas succeeded with those Alabama farmers because he paid attention to what they really needed, not what they said they needed. I can move through certain social circles because I pay attention to what people reveal about themselves without realizing it. Sarah was beginning to understand, but she needed to know more. What would you teach me to do? Thomas stood and walked to a cabinet, returning with a thick leather portfolio. We're going to teach you to read people the way most people read books. To understand the difference between what someone says and what they mean. To recognize opportunity in situations that look like disasters. He opened the portfolio to reveal what appeared to be case studies, detailed accounts of problems they had solved, complete with correspondence, financial records, and outcome assessments. More importantly, Margaret added, we're going to teach you to use your silence as a weapon instead of seeing it as a weakness. How? Dr. Ross grinned. Sarah, what did people in Millbrook assume about you because you couldn't speak? Sarah considered this, that I was simple, that I couldn't understand complex things, that I wasn't really there. And what did that allow you to do? Understanding began to dawn on Sarah's face. I could observe without being noticed. People would say things around me they wouldn't say around someone they thought was listening. Precisely, Thomas said. Now imagine if you combine that natural advantage with education, training, and resources. Imagine if you could read and write multiple languages, understand legal documents, comprehend financial instruments, and analyze business strategies. I would know things other people don't know. I know. And information, Margaret said with satisfaction, is the most valuable commodity in the world. Elizabeth pulled out yet another document. Let me show you something that happened just last month. A wealthy widow in Charleston was being cheated by her late husband's business partner. The man was systematically stealing from her, but she couldn't prove it because she wasn't allowed in the business meetings where the decisions were made. What did you do? We sent Thomas to offer his services as a spiritual advisor. Someone to help her commune with her deceased husband's spirit for guidance on business matters. Sarah nearly smiled, and I attended every business meeting, Thomas continued the story, sitting silently in the corner while the widow consulted the spirits. The business partner assumed I was just some superstitious nonsense he had to tolerate. He conducted his theft right in front of me, because he didn't think you would understand what you were seeing, or that I would care, even if I did understand. To him, I was just another ignorant savage playing to a grieving woman's foolishness. Margaret spread out financial documents. Within 2 weeks, we had documented every fraudulent transaction. The widow recovered $50,000, and we received 10% for our services. Sarah stared at the figures, trying to comprehend. Such wealth, $5,000 for 2 weeks' work? For 2 weeks sitting quietly and paying attention, Dr. Ross corrected. Which is exactly what you've been doing your entire life, except you never realized how valuable those skills could be. Thomas closed the portfolio and looked directly at Sarah. Your father sold you for 75 cents because the world taught him that a mute girl has no value. We're going to teach you that the world was wrong. Sarah felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest. Not hope. Exactly, hope was too fragile for what she was feeling. This was more like recognition. Recognition that these people weren't offering her charity or rescue. They were offering her partnership. When do we start? She signed. Margaret smiled. We already have. Everything we've shown you this morning is your first lesson. You've learned that observation is valuable, that prejudice can be turned to advantage, and that the most powerful people are often those who are underestimated. Elizabeth stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes. Your second lesson begins. In an hour, Margaret is going to teach you to read financial documents. This afternoon, Samuel will show you how to identify different types of soil and what that tells you about land values. Tomorrow, Thomas will begin teaching you legal concepts. And tonight? Thomas's scarred face split into a grin. Tonight, you're going to help us plan our next operation. A cotton plantation owner in Mississippi has a problem he can't solve. His workers are leaving, his crops are failing, and he's facing bankruptcy. He's written to us asking for help. What kind of help? The kind that requires someone who can sit quietly in his parlor, observe his household, and figure out what's really going wrong. Someone who can see what he's missing because he's too close to the problem. Sarah looked around the table at these four remarkable people who had just offered her something she had never imagined possible, the chance to be useful. Not pitied, not protected, not hidden away, but actually valuable. You really think I can learn to do this? Dr. Ross laughed. Sarah, you've been doing this your entire life. We're just going to teach you to do it for profit. And for the first time since her mother died, Sarah Mitchell felt like she might actually have a future worth living. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at Ridgeview, and her days had taken on a rhythm unlike anything she had ever experienced. Each morning brought new lessons that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. Today, she sat in Thomas's study, surrounded by law books that reached from floor to ceiling, practicing something that would have seemed impossible just a month ago, reading contracts. Not just reading the words, but understanding the spaces between them, the implications hidden in careful phrasing, the ways that legal language could be used to obscure rather than clarify. This clause here, Thomas said, pointing to a seemingly innocent paragraph in a land deed. What does it actually mean? Sarah studied the text carefully, her finger tracing the complex sentences. Over the past weeks, her reading had improved dramatically under Margaret's patient instruction, but legal documents still required intense concentration. It says the land can be used for farming and related activities. She signed slowly. But the phrase related activities isn't defined. And this part about mineral rights, it seems to give someone else control over anything found under the ground. Excellent, Thomas nodded approvingly. Now, why would that matter to our Mississippi client? Sarah had been studying the plantation owner's correspondence for days, learning to read between the lines of increasingly desperate letters. Because if someone else controls the mineral rights, they could start mining operations that would destroy his crops. And if he's borrowed money using the land as collateral, those activities might violate his loan agreements. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his scarred face. 3 weeks ago, you couldn't read a simple business letter. Now you're identifying potential legal traps that most lawyers would miss. Margaret was right about your natural aptitude for this work. The praise warmed Sarah in a way she wasn't used to. In Millbrook, her silence had been met with pity at best, irritation at worst. Here, her observations were valued, her insights welcomed, her progress celebrated. A knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. Elizabeth Harper entered, carrying a tray of tea and wearing an expression that suggested news. "We have visitors," she announced. 2 men from Nashville, asking questions about Thomas in town. Thomas immediately grew alert. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests someone is investigating our operations. They're being subtle about it, but Mrs. Whitman at the general store recognized the pattern. She sent her boy to warn us. Sarah watched the exchange with growing concern. "Are we in danger?" she signed. "Possibly," Thomas admitted. "Success like ours tends to attract attention, and not all of it is welcome." "Elizabeth, what did Mrs. Whitman learn about them?" Elizabeth settled into a chair, her expression serious. "They claim to be business associates looking to hire Thomas for a consultation. But they asked too many specific questions about his background, his methods, his associates." Her eyes flicked to Sarah meaningfully. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. They're asking about me? It's possible, Thomas said carefully. A mute girl disappearing from a poor family and reappearing in the company of a wealthy Cherokee would certainly be worth investigating if someone were looking for scandal or leverage. Elizabeth nodded grimly. Or if someone wanted to use her situation to discredit our entire operation. Mysterious businessman exploits desperate families would make an effective newspaper headline. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she signed. My father... Do you think they've spoken to him? We'll find out, Thomas said, standing and moving. To his desk. Elizabeth, send word to our contacts in Millbrook. I want to know everything about these men, who they represent, what they really want, and whether Ezra Mitchell is safe. As Elizabeth left to send the messages, Thomas returned to his chair across from Sarah. The easy atmosphere of their lesson had evaporated, replaced by something tense and watchful. Sarah, he said gently, I need you to understand something. What we do here, it challenges certain people's ideas about how the world should work. A Cherokee man with wealth and influence. A black woman moving freely through white society. A mute girl learning to read law books. These things threaten people who profit from keeping others in their assigned places. Are you saying I've put everyone in danger by coming here? No, Thomas said firmly. I'm saying that by choosing to grow beyond what they tried to make you, you've become dangerous to people who need you to stay small. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For weeks, she had been learning to see herself as valuable, capable, worthy of respect. Now that very transformation was potentially threatening the people who had given it to her. Maybe I should go back to my father, she signed slowly. If my being here is causing problems. Absolutely not, Thomas said with surprising vehemence. Sarah, running away doesn't solve anything. It only confirms their belief that you don't belong here. Before Sarah could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with urgency. Thomas, we need to talk, now. Her eyes found Sarah, both of us. They moved to the main room, where Dr. Ross was already waiting with a telegram in his hands. His usually cheerful expression was grave. This just came from our contact in Nashville, he said without preamble. The men asking questions aren't working alone. They represent a group of businessmen who've been disturbed by our recent successes. Margaret took the telegram and read it aloud. Investigation reveals subjects operating elaborate confidence scheme. Cherokee male posing as Harvard graduate. Negro female claiming medical knowledge. Mute girl likely kidnapped for immoral purposes. Recommend immediate intervention by federal authorities. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. They think you kidnapped me. It's a convenient story, Thomas said grimly. It allows them to discredit everything we've accomplished while positioning themselves as heroes rescuing a helpless girl. Dr. Ross set down another document. But there's more. They've been questioning our clients, trying to convince them that our successes were achieved through fraud or intimidation. Margaret's voice was hard with anger. They're not just coming after us personally. They're trying to destroy our business, our reputation, everything we've built. Sarah stood in the center of the room, watching these people who had transformed her life discuss the potential destruction of everything they had created. And she realized that the frightened girl who had stood outside Brennan's store 3 weeks ago would have immediately offered to leave, to sacrifice herself to protect others. But she wasn't that girl anymore. What do we do? She signed with steady hands. Thomas looked at her with something like pride. We do what we've always done. We turn their assumptions against them. How? Margaret smiled grimly. By giving them exactly what they expect to see, and letting their prejudices blind them to what's really happening. Elizabeth returned at that moment with additional news. Mrs. Whitman's boy brought more information. The men are planning to return tomorrow with a federal marshal. They intend to rescue Sarah and arrest Thomas for kidnapping. Sarah felt panic rise in her throat. but forced herself to think clearly. These people had taught her to observe, to analyze, to find opportunity in apparent disaster. They expect to find a helpless victim, she signed slowly, and a dangerous criminal taking advantage of her. Exactly, Thomas nodded. So what if that's precisely what we show them? The plan they developed over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. When the men returned with their marshal, they would find exactly what they expected: a frightened, confused girl who seemed to have been manipulated by a smooth-talking Cherokee charlatan. The key, Margaret explained as they worked out the details, is that your performance has to be completely convincing. You'll need to appear exactly as they imagine you, helpless, possibly traumatized, grateful for rescue. And then? Thomas's scarred face split into a grin that was partly anticipation, partly hunger. Then we let them take you back to Millbrook, where you'll demonstrate just how helpless and traumatized you really are. Sarah understood immediately. They weren't planning a retreat. They were planning a counterattack. Dr. Ross pulled out a map of the region. Sarah, by now you understand how business works in these counties. Information flows through specific channels. Money moves according to predictable patterns. Influence is exercised through known networks. And someone like me would be invisible in all of that. More than invisible, Elizabeth said with growing excitement. You'd be dismissed as completely irrelevant. A rescued victim to be pitied and ignored. Margaret leaned forward. While they're congratulating themselves on saving you from the dangerous Cherokee, you'll be in a position to observe their real operations, to see who's behind this investigation and why. Thomas stood and moved to the window, looking out over the valley that had become Sarah's home. It's dangerous, Sarah, if they discover what you're really doing. If they realize you're not the helpless victim they think you are. Then I use what you've taught me. Sarah signed with more confidence than she felt. I become what they expect. To see until I can gather enough information to destroy them. The room fell silent as the full implications of what they were planning settled over everyone. They were asking Sarah to voluntarily return to the powerless position she had escaped, to pretend to be everything she had learned she wasn't, all for the chance to protect the people who had given her a new life. There's something I need to. No, Sarah signed finally. When this is over, when we've dealt with these men and their investigation, will I still have a place here? Margaret's answer came without hesitation. Sarah, 3 weeks ago you were a girl with no prospects and no voice. Today you're someone who can read legal documents, analyze business problems, and devise strategies to overcome them. Tomorrow you'll be someone who infiltrated and defeated a group of powerful men who underestimated her. Yes, you'll have a place here. You'll have earned it. Thomas turned back from the window. But I need you to understand something else. What we're asking you to do. It's not just dangerous. It's a test. Not of your loyalty, we already know that, but of whether you've truly internalized everything we've taught you. About seeing opportunity in disaster. About recognizing that your greatest weakness can become your greatest strength, Dr. Ross clarified. These men see your silence and assume helplessness. But you and I know that silence is actually power, the power to observe without being observed, to understand without revealing understanding. Elizabeth stood and moved to Sarah's side. 3 weeks ago, your father sold you because he saw no other choice. Tomorrow, you're going to choose to sell yourself back into that world, but this time you'll control the transaction. Sarah looked around the room at these 4 people who had become her family, her teachers, her partners in building something unprecedented. The scared girl who had arrived here would never have been capable of what they were asking her to do. But that girl was gone. When do we start? She signed. Thomas smiled, and in his expression she saw respect, pride, and something that looked very much like love. We already have. The next morning, Sarah Mitchell would return to Millbrook as the rescued victim of a Cherokee kidnapper. But she would go armed with knowledge, skills, and determination that no one in that small Tennessee town could possibly imagine. And when she was finished, the men who had tried to destroy her new family would understand exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate a girl who had learned to weaponize her silence. The federal marshal's wagon rolled into Millbrook just after noon, stirring up dust and drawing curious stares from every window on Main Street. Sarah sat between two stern-faced men, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast in a perfect imitation of traumatized helplessness. Everything about her posture screamed victim, except for the sharp intelligence behind her carefully lowered gaze. 3 weeks of intensive training at Ridgeview had taught her to read people like open books, and the men flanking her were revealing more than they realized. The marshal, Jonas Whitmore, kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the telegraph office, suggesting he was working under pressure and expecting updates. The businessman to her left, who had introduced himself as Mr. Harrison Crawford, carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his money made him untouchable. But it was the third man, riding alongside the wagon, who truly concerned her. Unlike the others, he watched everything with calculating eyes that missed nothing. When Sarah had first been rescued from Thomas's estate, this man who called himself Robert Ashford had studied her responses with uncomfortable intensity, as if he suspected her traumatized silence might be something other than what it appeared. Now, as they approached Brennan's General Store, where this entire journey had begun, Sarah allowed herself one moment of genuine emotion. Her father stood, waiting on the wooden steps, and the sight of him nearly broke her carefully constructed facade. Ezra Mitchell looked like a different man. The medicine Thomas had provided had clearly worked. His color was better, his breathing easier, his posture straighter. But more than that, he looked prosperous. His clothes were new and well-fitted, his boots unpatched, his hair neatly trimmed. Someone with money had been taking care of him, someone who wanted to ensure he would be a convincing witness to his daughter's kidnapping. "Papa," Sarah whispered aloud, the first word she had spoken since her rescue. The sound of her own voice startled her. Weeks of communicating only in sign language had made spoken words feel foreign on her tongue. Ezra rushed forward as the marshal helped her down from the wagon, enfolding her in an embrace that felt both genuine and rehearsed. Over his shoulder, Sarah caught sight of several townspeople gathering to watch the reunion, their faces displaying the mixture of pity and morbid curiosity she remembered so well. "My poor girl," Ezra murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What did that savage do to you?" The word hit Sarah like a physical blow, but not for the reason her father intended. After weeks of living with Thomas, Margaret, Dr. Ross, and Elizabeth, people who had treated her as an equal and a partner, hearing Thomas dismissed as a savage made her stomach clench with anger. But anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. Play the role, she reminded herself. Give them exactly what they expect to see. He was kind to me, she said quietly, the words carefully chosen to sound like confused gratitude from a traumatized victim. I think he was lonely. Marshal Whitmore stepped forward, notebook in hand. "Miss Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about your time with the Cherokee. Did he hurt you? Did he take liberties?" Sarah shook her head, allowing tears to form in her eyes. "No, sir. He fed me, gave me clean clothes, but I was so scared. I didn't understand why I couldn't come home." Crawford exchanged a meaningful glance with Ashford. Sarah caught the look and filed it away for later analysis. These men weren't just concerned citizens seeking justice. They had their own agenda. "The important thing," Crawford said in a voice dripping with false compassion, "is that you're safe now. We've made sure your father has everything he needs to take care of you properly." There it is, Sarah thought. They had been supporting her father financially, ensuring his loyalty and cooperation in their narrative. Brennan emerged from his store, his expression a mixture of concern and calculation. "Miss Sarah, you look different. Better fed then. When you left." It was a shrewd observation, and Sarah realized that Brennan's mercantile instincts made him potentially dangerous to their plan. She needed to redirect his attention. "Mr. Brennan," she said with a trembling voice, "do you think? Could I work in your store? I need to feel useful again. I need to feel normal." The request clearly surprised everyone, but it was Crawford who responded first. "My dear girl, you should be resting, recovering from your ordeal. There's no need for you to work." "Please," Sarah insisted, putting a note of desperate pleading in her voice. "I can't just sit in the house thinking about what happened. I need to stay busy." What she actually needed was a position that would allow her to observe the comings and goings of everyone in Millbrook, to overhear conversations, to piece together the network of relationships and motivations that had led to the attack on RIDGEVIEW. Brennan stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose I could use help with inventory. And it might be good for you to be around normal folks again." Ashford's eyes narrowed slightly, and Sarah caught the expression. He was suspicious, but not yet convinced that his suspicions were justified. Over the next several days, Sarah settled into her new role with careful precision. To the townspeople of Millbrook, she appeared to be exactly what they expected, a traumatized girl slowly recovering from a terrible ordeal. She spoke little, moved hesitantly, and jumped at sudden noises in a way that reinforced everyone's assumptions about her mental state. But beneath the performance, she was gathering intelligence with all the skills Margaret and Thomas had taught. Her working in Brennan's store gave her access to the entire town's business. She observed who came and went, who had money to spend and who was struggling, who received mail from outside Millbrook and who was completely isolated. Most importantly, she began to map the network of relationships that connected seemingly unrelated people. It quickly became clear that Crawford and Ashford weren't operating alone. They had allies among Millbrook's more prosperous citizens, men who controlled the bank, the grain elevator, and the largest farms in the county. These men met regularly in the back room of Peterson's saloon, ostensibly for card games, but actually to coordinate their business activities. Sarah's muteness, which had once isolated her from these circles, now became her greatest asset. People spoke freely around her, assuming she either couldn't understand or wouldn't remember their conversations. They were wrong on both counts. The Cherokee's operation was more sophisticated than we initially realized, she overheard Crawford telling banker William Peterson during one such meeting. They had clients across 3 states, contracts worth thousands of dollars. And now those clients are looking for new service providers, Peterson replied with satisfaction. Providers who understand the proper social order. Ashford's voice was more cautious. "We need to be careful. Some of those clients might not appreciate learning they were dealing with what they'll see as criminals and frauds. That's why the girl's testimony is so important," Crawford said. "A mute victim rescued from kidnappers makes a much more compelling story than business competitors eliminated through legal technicalities." Sarah continued sweeping the store's front porch, her movements mechanical and mindless, while her mind raced with the implications of what she was hearing. These men hadn't just attacked Thomas's operation out of prejudice, though that was certainly part of it. They were positioning themselves to steal his clients and claim his business for themselves. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. "What about the father?" Peterson asked. "Can we count on his continued cooperation?" "Ezra Mitchell will say whatever we need him to say," Crawford replied with confidence. "We've made sure he understands that his daughter's safety depends on his truthfulness about her kidnapping." "They're threatening my father," Sarah realized. The medicine, the new clothes, the comfortable living arrangements, none of it was kindness. It was all leverage to ensure Ezra's compliance with their version of events. That evening, as Sarah helped her father prepare dinner in their small but now well-appointed house, she struggled with how much to reveal. Ezra had clearly been coached. on what to say about her time with Thomas, and she couldn't be certain how deep his commitment to their story went. "Papa," she said carefully, "are you feeling better? You look so much healthier than when I left." Ezra's face clouded with guilt. "Sarah, I need you to understand. When those men came to town asking questions, when they told me what might have happened to you, I was so afraid I'd made a terrible mistake." Good, Sarah thought. He's conflicted. That gives me something to work with. What kind of questions did they ask? About the Cherokee man. About whether he threatened me, whether he forced me to sell you to him. Ezra's voice broke slightly. They said men like him prey on desperate families, that he might have hurt you. Sarah took her father's hands, noting how much steadier they were now that he wasn't constantly fighting illness. "Papa, he didn't hurt me. He was ... kind. Different than what people here expected, but kind." "But Sarah, honey, kind men don't buy children from their fathers. What I did, God forgive me, what I did was wrong. You saved your own life," Sarah said gently, "and maybe you saved mine too." Ezra looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then decided to take a calculated risk. "I learned things, Papa. While I was away, I learned to read better, to understand how business works. I learned that the world is bigger than Millbrook." "They taught you to read?" "Among other things." Sarah watched her father's face carefully. "Papa, these men who are helping us now, why are they being so generous?" Ezra's expression grew uncomfortable. "They say it's Christian charity, helping the victims of crime. And what do they want in return? Just ... Just for me to tell the truth about what happened, about how you were taken." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the trap her father had been caught in. Crawford and his associates had created a narrative where Ezra was both victim and key witness, dependent on their generosity, but bound by their version of truth. "Papa, what if I told you that the truth was more complicated than what those men want you to say?" Ezra stared at her for a long moment. "Sarah, you're scaring me. These men ... important people. Powerful people. They say they're protecting us. From what? From retaliation. They say the Cherokee has friends, dangerous. Friends who might come looking for revenge." Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Crawford and his allies hadn't just stolen Thomas's business. They were using fear of retribution to control potential witnesses and maintain their version of events. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what 3 weeks at Ridgeview had done to transform Sarah Mitchell from a helpless victim into someone capable of fighting back. "Tomorrow," she decided, "I start gathering the evidence that will destroy them all." The girl who had been sold for 75 cents was about to teach some very powerful men exactly how expensive their assumptions could be. 2 weeks into her return to Millbrook, Sarah had assembled a mental map of corruption that would have impressed even Margaret's analytical mind. Working from her position behind Brennan's counter, she had identified the key players, documented their financial relationships, and begun to understand the true scope of their operation. But understanding the conspiracy and proving it were two different challenges entirely. The breakthrough came on a gray Tuesday morning when Robert Ashford made a mistake that revealed just how much he had underestimated the simple mute girl. He was watching. Sarah was sorting mail behind the counter when Ashford entered the store, accompanied by a man she didn't recognize, well-dressed, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time indoors, reviewing documents rather than working in the sun. They spoke in low voices near the back of the store, clearly believing they were far enough from Sarah to avoid being overheard. They were wrong. "The depositions need to be consistent," the stranger was saying as he examined a bolt of fabric with feigned interest. "Any contradictions will raise questions we can't afford to answer." "Mitchell's testimony is solid," Ashford replied. "He'll swear that Cherokee threatened him, forced him to hand over his daughter. The girls too traumatized to contradict him effectively. Sarah continued sorting letters with mechanical precision, her face a mask of vacant concentration while her mind recorded every word. "What about the business records?" the stranger pressed. "Some of Blackwater's former clients are asking uncomfortable questions. That's being handled. Crawford has convinced most of them that they were victims of an elaborate fraud. They're grateful to learn the truth before they lost more money." Victims of a fraud, Sarah thought grimly. While the real fraud is being perpetrated right in front of them. The stranger pulled out a leather portfolio, ostensibly to show Ashford fabric samples, but Sarah caught a glimpse of legal documents inside. The federal charges should be filed within the week: kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy. Blackwater and his associates won't be able to operate anywhere in the territories after this. Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment as the implications hit her. They weren't just trying to steal Thomas's business. They were planning to destroy him completely, to ensure he could never compete with them again. "And if the Cherokee tries to fight the charges?" Ashford asked. "With what? His Harvard education?" The stranger's voice dripped with contempt. "A savage with forged credentials and a few lucky business deals isn't going to survive federal court. Especially not when we have witnesses testifying to his criminal activities." Sarah resumed her mechanical sorting, but her mind was racing. These men had created a perfect trap. They controlled the witnesses, they had fabricated evidence of criminality, and they were using the federal court system to eliminate their competition. Thomas, Margaret, Dr. Ross, and Elizabeth were walking into a legal ambush. They couldn't possibly win unless someone warned them, but warning them would mean revealing her true purpose in Millbrook, abandoning her mission, and potentially putting her father in danger. Crawford had made it clear that Ezra's continued health and prosperity depended on his cooperation with their narrative. The stranger finished his business and left, but Ashford lingered, studying Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. She forced herself to maintain her vacant expression, to give no sign that she had heard or understood anything significant. "Miss Mitchell," Ashford said finally, "you seem to be adapting well to your return home." Sarah looked up with carefully crafted confusion. "Sir? I imagine it must be difficult, adjusting to normal life after your ordeal." "I try not to think about it," Sarah replied in the hesitant voice she had perfected. "Mr. Brennan keeps me busy, and Papa takes good care of me." Ashford nodded, but his eyes remained calculating. "Your father is a good man. It would be unfortunate if anything disrupted his recovery." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah allowed fear to flicker across her features, not feigned fear of Ashford, but genuine terror for her father's safety. "I just want things to be normal again," she whispered. "Of course you do." Ashford's smile was cold. "And they will be, as long as everyone continues to tell the truth about what happened." After he left, Sarah stood behind the counter, trembling with rage and frustration. Every instinct screamed at her to abandon this charade, to ride to Ridgeview and warn Thomas about the federal charges being prepared. But doing so would confirm Ashford's suspicions and put her father directly in the line of fire. She needed another way. That evening, as she helped Ezra prepare dinner, Sarah made a decision that would test everything Thomas and Margaret had taught her about turning weakness into strength. "Papa," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, honey?" "The men who helped us Mr. Crawford and the others. They've been so generous. But I wonder, what do they really get out of helping people like us?" Ezra's hands paused in their work. "What do you mean?" "I mean, they're wealthy men. Important men. Why would they care about what happened to a poor girl from a poor family?" "Sarah, you shouldn't question the motives of people who've been kind to us." "I'm not questioning them, Papa. I'm just curious. In the store, I see how business works. People don't usually give away money unless they expect to get something back. Ezra set down his knife and looked at his daughter with concern. "What are you really asking me?" Sarah took a deep breath, preparing to take the biggest risk of her life. "I'm asking if you ever wondered whether the story they want you to tell about my kidnapping might not be the whole truth." The silence that followed was deafening. Ezra stared at his daughter, as if seeing her clearly for the first time since her return. "Sarah," he said very quietly, "what exactly happened to you while you were gone?" "I learned things, Papa, important things. About how the world really works, about what I'm capable of, about the difference between being rescued and being used." Ezra sat down heavily at their small table. Are you saying those men have been lying to me?" "I'm saying they've been using you. Using both of us. And if we don't do something about it, they're going to destroy people who don't deserve to be destroyed. The Cherokee man. Thomas... He didn't kidnap you, did he?" Sarah shook her head. "He saved me, Papa. He and his family took me in, taught and me skills I never dreamed I could learn. Treated me like I had value beyond being someone's burden or victim." Ezra's face crumpled. "And God forgive me. I helped these men paint him as a criminal." "You did what you thought was right with the information you had," Sarah said gently. "But now we have different information. The question is, what are we going to do with it?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, Sarah saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, not the desperate love of a dying man, but the determined anger of a father who had discovered his child was in danger. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. They couldn't stop the federal charges from being filed Crawford, and his allies had too much momentum for that. But they could ensure that when Thomas and his associates faced those charges, they would have evidence to fight back. "You want me to steal documents from Crawford's house?" Ezra asked incredulously. "Not steal," Sarah corrected. "You're going to be invited. Tomorrow you're going to tell Crawford that you're worried about testifying, that you want to make sure your story matches what really happened. You're going to ask to review the documentation so you can be sure you remember everything correctly. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to be visiting Mrs. Crawford, bringing her preserves from the store as a thank you gift for her husband's kindness. While you're distracting him with questions about testimony, I'll be searching his study." Ezra stared at his daughter with amazement. "When did you become so calculating?" "When I learned that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all." The next day, their plan unfolded with precision that would have made Margaret proud. Ezra played the role of anxious witness perfectly, his genuine nervousness about the deception making his performance entirely convincing. Crawford, flattered by what seemed like eager cooperation, was happy to review the facts of the case with his star witness. Meanwhile, Sarah charmed her way into Crawford's home with jars of Elizabeth Harper's jam recipes, which she had memorized. During her weeks at Ridgeview, Mrs. Crawford, a lonely woman hungry for female company, welcomed the quiet girl who seemed so grateful for her husband's protection. While the two women sat in the parlor discussing domestic matters, Sarah's trained eye cataloged everything about the house, the expensive furnishings that spoke of recent wealth, the maps on the walls that showed properties across 3 states, the correspondence lying carelessly on side tables. Most importantly, she identified Crawford's private study and noted that it was currently unlocked. "Mrs. Crawford," Sarah said hesitantly, "might I use your facilities?" "The walk here was longer than I expected." "Of course, dear." "Up the stairs, second door on the right." But instead of turning right at the top of the stairs, Sarah turned left, slipping into Crawford's study with the silent grace Elizabeth had taught her during their lessons on moving through hostile territory. The study was a testament to organized greed. Ledgers lined the shelves, recording business dealings that spanned the entire South. But it was the correspondence on Crawford's desk that provided the evidence Sarah needed. letters from potential clients, asking about services previously provided by the Cherokee operation. Responses from Crawford positioning himself as a more reliable alternative. Financial records showing payments to federal officials for expedited legal services. And most damning of all, a detailed plan for dividing Thomas's client base among Crawford's associates. Sarah's photographic memory, sharpened by weeks of intensive training, absorbed every detail. Names, dates, amounts, specific accusations, planned testimony, everything needed to prove that the federal charges against Thomas were part of a calculated business conspiracy. But as she turned to leave, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Crawford's voice carried up from below. "Thank you, Ezra. I think we have everything we need for your testimony. Let me just get that document from my study. Double quote. Sarah felt her heart stop. She had perhaps 30 seconds before Crawford discovered her in his private sanctuary, with no legitimate reason for being there. In that moment, all of her training crystallized into perfect clarity. She moved to the window, opened it quietly, and knocked over a small decorative vase as she did so. The crash echoed through the house. By the time Crawford reached his study, Sarah was leaning out the window, her face pale with apparent distress. "Mr. Crawford," she stammered as he burst through the door, "I'm so sorry. I got confused looking for the facilities, and when I saw this beautiful window, I felt dizzy and knocked over your vase, I think. I think I'm still not quite myself. After everything that happened." Crawford's suspicion melted into concern as he saw the broken pottery and Sarah's trembling hands. "Of course, my dear. You've been through a terrible ordeal. Let me help you downstairs." As Crawford led her from the study, Sarah caught sight of Ezra waiting in the hallway below. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw in them the same determination that was burning in her own chest. They had what they needed. Now they just had to figure out how to use it without getting themselves killed in the process. The girl who had been sold for 75 cents was about to discover that some choices, once made, change everything that comes after. And she was ready for that change. The federal marshals arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday morning, their official wagon and stern expressions drawing crowds of curious onlookers. Sarah watched from behind Brennan's store window as they conducted their business with ruthless efficiency, collecting sworn statements from Ezra, interviewing witnesses, and building what appeared to be an airtight case against Thomas Blackwater and his associates. But appearances, as Sarah had learned, could be devastatingly deceiving. 3 days earlier, under cover of darkness, she had made a journey that would have been impossible for the helpless victim everyone believed her to be. Riding her father's old mare bareback through mountain trails she had memorized during her weeks at Ridgeview, Sarah had carried information that would change everything. The reunion with Thomas, Margaret, Dr. Ross, and Elizabeth had been brief but electric with purpose. In Margaret's study, by lamplight, Sarah had recounted every detail of Crawford's conspiracy, every name she had memorized, every piece of evidence she had gathered. "They're using the federal court system as a weapon," she had explained to the assembled group. "Crawford has judges in his pocket, marshals taking payments, and enough fabricated evidence to destroy all of you permanently." Thomas had listened with growing admiration as Sarah outlined the scope of the conspiracy. "You've accomplished something remarkable, Sarah. But if we're going to fight this, we need more than intelligence. We need leverage." "What kind of leverage?" Sarah had asked. Margaret had smiled grimly. "The kind that turns hunters into prey." Now watching the marshals complete their work in Millbrook, Sarah knew that the real battle was about to begin. But this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone, or in secret. This time, she would be standing with her chosen family, using every skill they had taught her to protect what they had built together. The confrontation came sooner than expected. That afternoon, as Sarah was closing the store, Ashford appeared. With 2 men she didn't recognize federal agents, judging by their bearing and the way they studied everything with calculating eyes. Miss Mitchell, Ashford said with false kindness, these gentlemen would like to ask you a few questions about your experience with the Cherokee kidnappers. The lead agent, a thin man with cold blue eyes, stepped forward. I'm Agent Samuel Morrison, Miss Mitchell. We understand you spent several weeks in captivity with a criminal named Thomas Blackwater. Sarah nodded, allowing uncertainty to cloud her expression. Yes, sir. During that time, did you observe any illegal activities? Fraud, perhaps, or threats made against potential clients? Here it comes, Sarah thought. The moment where I choose between the life they want me to live and the life I've learned I deserve. I'm not sure I understand, she said carefully. What kind of illegal activities? Agent Morrison exchanged a glance with his partner. We have evidence that Blackwater and his associates were operating an elaborate confidence scheme, defrauding wealthy landowners across multiple states. As someone who lived in their compound, you would have seen evidence of this criminal enterprise. Sarah blinked slowly, as if processing information that was too complex for her traumatized mind. I saw them reading a lot of papers, writing letters. People came to visit sometimes. What kind of people? Rich people, I think. They had nice clothes, expensive horses. Sarah paused, then added with apparent confusion, but everyone seemed happy when they left. Like they had gotten what they came for. Morrison's expression hardened. Miss Mitchell, we need you to understand something. These people are criminals who took advantage of your father's desperation. They kidnapped you, held you against your will, and used you as part of their criminal activities. Don't you want to see justice done? Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest, but she channeled it into perfect performance. I just want to forget about it, she whispered. I want to feel safe again. You'll feel safe once these criminals are in federal prison, Ashford interjected. But we need your testimony to make that happen. What? What would I have to do? Morrison pulled out a prepared statement. Simply sign this document confirming what you witnessed. We've already spoken to your father. He's been very helpful in establishing the facts of your kidnapping. Sarah took the document with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the carefully constructed lies. According to this statement, she had witnessed Thomas threatening potential clients, seen evidence of fraudulent documentation, and heard discussions of criminal activities. Every word was designed to destroy the people who had given her a new life. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. Miss Mitchell, these are dangerous criminals. Every day they remain free. They pose a threat to other innocent families. Don't you understand that? I understand, Sarah said quietly. I understand more than you think. The words carried a weight. That made Morrison study her more carefully. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Miss Mitchell, Ashford said with forced gentleness, perhaps you should discuss this with your father. I'm sure he can help. You understand why cooperation is so important. That evening, Sarah and Ezra sat in their small kitchen, the federal statement lying between them like an accusation. The house felt different, now no longer a refuge provided by generous benefactors, but a cage built from threats and false promises. They want me to sign it, Sarah said simply. Ezra stared at the document. If you don't, then they'll know I'm not what I appear to be. And they'll make good on their threats against you. And if you do sign it, then I destroy the people who saved my life to protect the people who are using yours as leverage. They sat in silence for a long moment, father and daughter contemplating choices that would define not just their futures, but their very souls. Sarah, Ezra said finally, what do you think your mother would want you to do? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her mother, who had died when Sarah was 12, had been the one person who never saw her daughter's silence as a limitation. She had taught Sarah to read lips, to observe body language, to understand that communication went far beyond spoken words. Mama would want me to fight, Sarah said without hesitation. She never backed down from bullies, no matter how powerful they were. Ezra nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. We'll fight. Papa, if we do this, there's no going back. These men, they have money, influence, federal agents on their payroll. If we move against them and lose, then we lose fighting for what's right instead of living as prisoners of what's wrong. Ezra reached across the table and took his daughter's hands. Sarah, I've watched you these past weeks. You're not the same girl, the girl I sold for 75 cents. You've become someone strong, someone brave, someone who sees possibilities where others see only problems. I won't be the reason. You go back to being invisible. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in her life, she felt the full force of her father's love without the weight of his desperation behind it. What do you need me to do? Ezra asked. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark streets of Millbrook. Somewhere out there, Crawford and his allies were celebrating their approaching victory. Federal agents were preparing to arrest Thomas and his family. And tomorrow, those same agents would return for her signature on a document that would make their triumph complete. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had forgotten that the most dangerous opponent is the one who has nothing left to lose. Tomorrow morning, Sarah said, turning back to her father, you're going to go to Agent Morrison and tell him that I'm ready to sign the statement. You're going to seem nervous, worried about my mental state, concerned that the stress might cause me to say the wrong thing. And what will you be doing? Sarah smiled, and in that expression, Ezra saw echoes of the formidable woman his daughter was becoming. I'm going to give them exactly what they've asked for. My testimony about what I witnessed at Thomas Blackwater's compound. But Sarah, if you tell the truth about what you saw, who says I'm going to tell the truth? Sarah's smile grew wider. Papa, they want me to sign a statement full of lies because they think I'm too traumatized and simple to understand what really happened. Tomorrow, I'm going to show them just how wrong they are about what I understand. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the sharp light that made everything seem more real, more immediate. Sarah dressed carefully in her most worn dress, braided her hair with nervous fingers, and practiced the expression of confused gratitude she had perfected over the past weeks. But beneath the performance, her mind was crystalline with purpose. Agent Morrison, Ashford, and Crawford had gathered in Brennan's store for the signing ceremony, along with a federal notary who would make Sarah's statement legally binding. The atmosphere was one of quiet, triumph, powerful men congratulating themselves on a job well done. Miss Mitchell, Morrison said as Sarah entered with her father, we appreciate your courage in coming forward. Your testimony will help ensure that dangerous criminals face justice. Sarah nodded hesitantly, then looked around the room with apparent confusion. Will there be many people at the trial? Some, Morrison replied. Federal proceedings tend to attract attention, especially cases involving kidnapping and fraud. Good, Sarah said softly. I want people to hear what really happened. Crawford smiled with satisfaction. Of course you do, my dear. Truth has a way of demanding to be heard. Sarah picked up the pen, holding it with the careful concentration of someone who still struggled with complex writing. Mr. Morrison, before I sign this, could you read it out loud? I want to make sure I understand everything it says. Morrison nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of careful, confused behavior he expected from a traumatized victim. He began reading the statement aloud, each carefully crafted lie designed to paint Thomas as a criminal and Sarah as his helpless victim. As he read, Sarah nodded along, occasionally asking for clarification on words or phrases that seemed to confuse her. But when Morrison finished reading, Sarah did something none of them expected. She set down the pen and looked directly at Agent Morrison, with eyes that suddenly held no confusion at all. That's interesting, she said in a voice that was clear, steady, and completely different from the hesitant whisper they had grown accustomed to. Almost everything in that statement is a lie. The room went dead silent. Excuse me? Morrison said carefully. Sarah stood, her posture straight and confident, all pretense of traumatized helplessness abandoned. I said that statement is filled with lies. And before you arrest anyone for fraud, Agent Morrison, perhaps you should investigate the real criminal conspiracy in this room. Crawford's face had gone white. Sarah, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Mr. Crawford, just like I know exactly what you've been doing. Sarah turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying the authority Thomas had taught her to project. Gentlemen, my name is Sarah Mitchell, and I have a story to tell you. But it's not the story you've been expecting to hear. And with that, the girl who had been sold for 75 cents began to speak with a voice that would shake the foundations of everything her enemies had built. The silence that followed. Sarah's declaration stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Agent Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, while Crawford's face cycled through expressions of shock, rage, and desperate calculation. But it was Ashford who recovered. First, his lawyer's instincts kicking in despite the obvious trap he now found himself in. Miss Mitchell, Ashford said with forced calm, you've clearly been under tremendous stress. Perhaps we should postpone this until you've had time to rest. I've never been more clear-headed in my life, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that Margaret had taught her to project. And I think it's time everyone in this room heard the truth about what's really been happening in Millbrook. Morrison stepped forward, his agent's training asserting itself. Young lady, you're interfering with a federal investigation. I strongly advise you to. To what? Sign a statement full of lies so you can arrest innocent people while the real criminals go free? Sarah's eyes blazed. Agent Morrison, tell me something. How much did Crawford pay you to file those federal charges? The accusation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Morrison's face went rigid. That's a serious allegation. Miss Mitchell, I hope you have evidence to support it. Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that made every man in the room suddenly realize they had gravely underestimated her. As a matter of fact, I do. She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This is a copy of a letter from your office to Crawford, acknowledging receipt of payment for expedited legal services. The original is currently in the possession of Federal Judge Harrison Williams in Nashville, along with copies of financial records, correspondence, and detailed documentation of this entire conspiracy. Crawford lunged forward. That's impossible. Those documents were in my private study. Yes, they were, Sarah agreed pleasantly. Right up until I copied them 2 weeks ago. Did you really think a traumatized mute girl wouldn't be able to read your handwriting? Morrison's hand was now openly resting on his gun. Miss Mitchell, you're making very serious accusations against federal officers. If you can't substantiate these claims... Oh, but I can. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. Because unlike you, Agent Morrison, I didn't work alone. The door to Brennan's store opened, and Thomas Blackwater walked in. But this wasn't the mysterious hooded figure who had haunted Millbrook's imagination. This was Thomas as Sarah had learned to see him, Harvard-educated, impeccably dressed, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. Behind him came Margaret, Dr. Ross, and Elizabeth Harper, each carrying themselves with the bearing of successful professionals rather than the criminals Crawford had painted them to be. Gentlemen, Thomas said with urbane politeness, I believe you were expecting me to be in shackles by now. I'm afraid I have some disappointing news. Crawford's face had gone ashen. This is impossible. The federal charges have been dismissed, Margaret announced, stepping forward with a leather portfolio, along with criminal charges being filed against you, Mr. Crawford, and your associates for conspiracy, fraud, attempted kidnapping, and bribery of federal officials. Agent Morrison was backing toward the door, but found his way blocked by two men Sarah didn't recognize until she saw the federal badges they were displaying. "Agent Morrison," one of them said. "I'm Agent David Sullivan, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for corruption and conspiracy to violate federal racketeering laws." As Morrison was being handcuffed, Crawford made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "This is all fabricated. That girl is a liar, a criminal herself. She was kidnapped, traumatized, ... "Mr. Crawford," Dr. Ross interrupted with clinical precision, "I'm a licensed physician, and I can assure you that Miss Mitchell shows no signs of trauma or mental incapacity. In fact, her cognitive abilities are quite remarkable." Elizabeth Harper stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex operations. "What Miss Mitchell shows signs of is excellent education in business, law, financial analysis, and investigative technique. Skills she acquired during her time as a voluntary student at Ridgeview Academy." "Ridgeview Academy?" Ashford asked weakly. Thomas smiled. "Our private educational institution, fully licensed by the state of Tennessee. Miss Mitchell was never kidnapped, Mr. Ashford. She was enrolled as a student, with her father's full knowledge and consent." Ezra stepped forward, his voice steady, with newfound confidence. "I never sold my daughter, gentlemen. I invested in her education. Best 75 cents I ever spent." Crawford was staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. But you couldn't even read when you left Millbrook." "Actually, I could read quite well," Sarah replied. "I just hadn't learned to read the kinds of documents that would help me understand how people like you operate. Thomas and Margaret taught me that." Margaret opened her portfolio and began distributing documents to everyone in the room. "These are copies of Miss Mitchell's academic records, her enrollment agreement, and her graduation certificate from our advanced business program. As you can see, she completed her studies with highest honors." Agent Sullivan, who had finished arresting Morrison, turned to Crawford. "Mr. Crawford, you're also under arrest. We have evidence of your conspiracy to defraud multiple businesses, your bribery of federal officials, and your attempted extortion of witnesses." As Crawford was being handcuffed, he stared at Sarah with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You planned this entire thing, ... "No, Mr. Crawford," Sarah corrected. "You planned it. I just learned how to turn your plan against you. That's what happens when you underestimate people." Ashford, realizing he was about to share his associate's fate, made one final attempt at negotiation. "Miss Mitchell, surely we can come to some arrangement. There's no need for this to go any further." "Actually, there is," Thomas said smoothly. "You see, Mr. Ashford, your conspiracy didn't just target us. It targeted our clients, our students, and our entire educational mission. That kind of attack requires a comprehensive response." Elizabeth Harper consulted a document. "Mr. Ashford, you're being charged as an accessory to conspiracy and fraud. But more importantly, your law license is being reviewed by the Tennessee Bar Association based on evidence of professional misconduct." As the last of the conspirators were led away in handcuffs, the store fell quiet except for the soft murmur of Agent Sullivan conferring with his colleagues. Sarah stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the people who had become her family, finally free to drop the last vestiges of the helpless facade she had maintained for so long. Brennan, who had watched the entire drama unfold with amazement, finally found his voice. "Miss Sarah, I don't understand. How did you ... when did you?" "Mr. Brennan," Sarah said with a gentle smile, "I learned that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. You see me as a simple mute girl from a poor family, but that allowed me to observe, to listen, to understand things that people thought I couldn't comprehend." Thomas placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. What Sarah accomplished here required intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking that would impress any business school professor. She turned her perceived weakness into her greatest strength. Margaret nodded approvingly. And she did it while maintaining perfect cover for weeks, gathering evidence that professional investigators might have missed. Dr. Ross grinned. I believe this calls for a celebration. Sarah, would you like to tell Mr. Brennan about your graduation project? Sarah's eyes lit up. Actually, I think Mr. Brennan should be the first to know. Thomas and Margaret have offered to help me start my own business here in Millbrook. What kind of business? Brennan asked, still processing everything he had witnessed. Consulting, Sarah replied. I've learned that there are a lot of problems in small towns that conventional solutions can't address. Problems that require someone who can observe carefully, think creatively, and communicate in ways that go beyond just talking. Elizabeth Harper smiled. Sarah has already identified several opportunities right here in Millbrook. Businesses that are struggling, land disputes that could be resolved, resources that aren't being utilized effectively. And, Margaret added with satisfaction, she's developed a client base that includes several of Crawford's former victims. Apparently, wealthy landowners are very interested in consulting services from the young woman who exposed a major conspiracy. Thomas looked around the room at the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrests. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Mitchell, founder and president of Mitchell Consulting Services. In 6 months, she'll be one of the most successful business people in Hamilton County. Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with praise or recognition. It was the warmth of belonging, of purpose, of finally understanding her own worth. There's one more thing, she said, turning to her father. Papa, I'd like you to be my business partner. You know this community better than anyone, and you understand what it means to overcome adversity. Ezra's eyes filled with tears of pride. Sarah, honey, I don't know anything about business. You know about people, Sarah replied. You know about struggle, about hope, about the difference between giving up and finding another way. Those are the most important business skills of all. Agent Sullivan approached the group as his colleagues finished their work. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that your evidence was instrumental in uncovering a conspiracy that spanned 3 states. Crawford and his associates were targeting multiple businesses, not just yours. What will happen to them? Sarah asked. Federal prison, most likely. And their victims will be able to recover damages now that we understand the scope of their operations. Thomas nodded with satisfaction. Justice served through proper channels, exactly as it should be. As the federal agents departed with their prisoners, the atmosphere in the store began to lighten. Sarah found herself surrounded by townspeople who were seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a poor mute girl to be pitied, but as someone who had accomplished something extraordinary. Mrs. Whitman from the boarding house stepped forward. Hesitantly, Miss Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. We never saw. We never understood. Mrs. Whitman, Sarah said gently, you saw what everyone expected you to see. That's not your fault. But maybe now we can all start seeing each other differently. Brennan cleared his throat. Miss Sarah, if you're starting a business here in Millbrook, you're going to need an office. I've got that empty room upstairs. Be honored to rent it to you. Actually, Sarah said with a smile, I was hoping to buy a building of my own. I understand the old bank building is for sale? The old bank building was the largest, most prominent structure in Millbrook, far too expensive for anyone in town to afford. But as Sarah stood there, radiating quiet confidence and surrounded by successful partners, no one doubted that she could make it happen. Margaret consulted her notes. The building is owned by the estate of William Peterson, Crawford's associate, who will soon have legal troubles of his own. I believe they'll be motivated to sell quickly and quietly. Perfect, Sarah said. Thomas, would you mind negotiating the purchase? I think they'll be more cooperative with someone who has a Harvard law degree. Thomas laughed. It would be my pleasure. Consider it a graduation gift. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, Sarah stood outside the store with her father, looking at the town that had once seemed like a prison, but now felt like possibility. The old bank building would become the headquarters of Mitchell Consulting Services. The townspeople who had once dismissed her were now potential clients. And the girl who had been sold for 75 cents was about to become the wealthiest person in Hamilton County. Sarah, Ezra said quietly, your mother would be so proud. I know, Papa, Sarah replied, taking his arm. But you know what? I think she always knew this day would come. She just had to wait for me to figure out who I really was. As they walked home together, father and daughter planning the future they would build side by side, neither of them noticed the small crowd that had gathered outside Brennan's store. Townspeople talking in excited whispers about the girl who had fooled them all, the conspiracy that had been operating right under their noses, and the extraordinary transformation they had just witnessed. But Sarah, Mitchell was no longer concerned with what people thought of her. She had learned that the only opinion that truly mattered was her own, and she finally knew exactly who she was. The girl who had been sold for 75 cents was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who would spend the rest of her life proving that there was no limit to what someone could achieve when they refused to accept the world's definition of their worth. And it all began with a father's desperate love, a Cherokee's unexpected kindness, and 75 cents that bought not a transaction, but a transformation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.